We'll now look at a brief background to the Paul's letters to the Galatians. When we talk about Galatians, we first of all have to ask, to which Galatians did Paul write this letter? Most people would probably just go ahead and assume that Paul was writing to those Galatians who Paul and Barnabas encountered on their first missionary trip. This is oftentimes is referred now to as the Southern Galatian theory, because Paul and Barnabas, according to the book of Acts, traveled to places that were on the southern part of Asia Minor. But more recently, some have questioned this assumption and have wondered if possibly Paul is writing to the area that was commonly designated at this time in the first century as Galatia. And then assuming that Paul had actually traveled in the northern part of Asia Minor. And those scholars that argue this will refer to this theory as the North Galatian theory. Just to refresh your memory here about the area that Paul traveled, here's a map about Asia Minor, and you can see on this map some of the areas that Paul and Barnabas visit on their first trip. They went to Perga, they went to Pisidian Antioch, they went to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. These were the areas in which they traveled. But the area known as Galatia at this time was actually north of this region. And so some have then speculated as to the possibility that that's where Paul went, or Paul was writing. So it becomes very difficult to fix the date and place of the writings of Galatians. Many scholars, though, argue that it seems most likely that this was one of Paul's first letters to write to churches. And therefore, if you were aligning the books of Paul's, or the letters of Paul, and you wanted to put them in kind of chronological sequence, you could likely have placed Galatians as the first letter. You might also put First and Second Thessalonians as one of the first letters, but Galatians certainly could have been. Our current books of the New Testament are arranged primarily according to size, at least as far as Paul's letters are concerned. So Paul's biggest letter is Romans, and so that's why it's the first in the collection of Paul's writings. Then First and 2 Corinthians, and then Galatians, and then getting smaller until you get all the way down to Philemon. But if you were doing it chronologically, you very likely could put Galatians. And so the book of Galatians is a very important letter to try and ascertain maybe some of Paul's earliest concepts, some of his earliest ideas. Big question as well is in dating this, has Paul already experienced the Jerusalem Council? And if he had, then why doesn't he make use of some of the decisions that were arrived at that council meeting when he's trying to make his points to the Galatians? The silence of Paul with reference to that council is why some have thought that Paul has written this prior to that meeting. So if it's prior to the Jerusalem Council, then it would be in the late 40s. Now there may be reasons why Paul did not want to refer to the Jerusalem Council, and that he wants to go ahead and exert his own apostleship. He doesn't want to see himself as kind of somehow or another underneath or below in authority the leadership of James or Peter or others who had met at that council. And so he may have just decided to not appeal to that decision and just to exert his own, and therefore it could have come after the Jerusalem Council. And if the North Galatian theory is correct, then this would more than likely suggest even a later date for the book. So we don't know where Paul is when he writes Galatians, and we don't know the date. But we do get a sense of the purpose of the letter, and Paul wrote this letter primarily to combat the effects of several heretical teachers who were insisting that Gentile male converts to Christianity, converts to Christ, believers in Jesus, be circumcised. And by being circumcised, they would thereby become proselytes to Judaism. So in other words, the debate is, does one have to be a Jew in order to become a Christian? The Jerusalem Council made that quite clear, that no, Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. And so that's why this kind of interest in between the Jerusalem Council and their decision and the teachings of Paul here are so important. So we don't know the exact nature of the heretical group. Most have just assumed that these are Jews who are requiring circumcision. It could be that they are Gentiles who have already been circumcised, who are also requiring other Gentiles to be circumcised. Or it could just be, as is often the case, often assumed, that they are the circumcised, as Paul refers to them, that is, they are Jews who are requiring this. And so Paul wants to insist in this letter that is not necessary, that being circumcised as a Gentile is, in a sense, devaluing the effects or the purpose or the significance of Jesus' death on the cross, and is disappointed. This is one of Paul's angriest letters. He's quite disappointed in the Galatians who have succumbed to this teaching. And so that gives us a little bit of a background to this very important letter.